If you're over 60 and someone has told you that your brain is essentially finished developing, that whatever you've got at this point is what you're stuck with, I want you to take a breath and hear something that neuroscience has been quietly proving for the last 25 years. That idea is wrong. It's not a hopeful exaggeration. It's not a motivational poster. It is wrong at the level of the actual biology. And the research is now clear enough that the old, "you can't teach an old dog new tricks" belief belongs in the same category as the ones that used to tell people the earth was flat and that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. Your brain can change. Your brain does change. And it does it at 65, at 75, at 85, in ways that researchers can measure on an MRI scan. I'm Steven, and this channel exists to translate current, peer-reviewed research into practical information for adults over 60. Today we're covering neuroplasticity, what it actually is, what the evidence really says, where the honest limits are, and what you can start doing this week to take advantage of it. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And when we get to the practical part, I genuinely love to hear in the comments which of these habits you're already doing and which one you plan to add. Let's start with the word itself, because it's thrown around so casually online that it's starting to lose meaning. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to form new connections between neurons, to strengthen existing pathways through repeated use, and in some regions, to generate new brain cells entirely. The word plasticity here doesn't mean flimsy or artificial. It means moldable, capable of being shaped. The way clay is plastic. The way your brain, it turns out, has always been. For most of the 20th century, the mainstream view in neuroscience was that this moldability essentially ended in early adulthood. The brain you had at 25 was more or less the brain you'd have at 75, minus some steady deterioration along the way. That view held for decades, and it shaped how doctors talked to patients, how rehabilitation was approached after strokes, and how older adults thought about their own possibilities for learning and change. The problem is that the view was based on the limits of what could be measured at the time, not on what was actually true about the brain. The evidence started shifting in the late 1990s and 2000s, and one of the most famous studies came out of University College London in the year 2000, from a cognitive neuroscientist named Eleanor Maguire. Maguire and her colleagues used MRI scans to compare the brains of London taxi drivers to a matched control group of people who didn't drive taxis. Now, London taxi drivers are unusual. To get licensed, they have to pass an exam called the Knowledge, which requires them to memorize roughly 25,000 streets and thousands of landmarks across central London. It takes most trainees 3 to 4 years of full-time study to pass. It is, quite literally, one of the most demanding acts of learning that any human being routinely undertakes. What Maguire found was that the taxi drivers had measurably larger posterior hippocampi than the control group. The hippocampus is the region of the brain most involved in spatial memory and navigation. The taxi drivers had, in a very literal physical sense, grown that part of their brains through years of intense practice. And here's the part that mattered even more. The size of the change correlated with how many years each driver had been on the job. The longer they'd been navigating London, the more that region had grown. Later research from the same group followed trainees over 4 years, before they started studying and after they'd either passed or failed the licensing exam. The people who passed showed the hippocampal growth. The people who failed. This wasn't a case of people with naturally bigger hippocampi being drawn to taxi driving. The brain was changing in response to the learning, in adults well into middle age. That study cracked something open in neuroscience, and the research that has followed in the last 2 decades has continued to reinforce it. In 2015, a study published in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience took 17 healthy adults with an average age of 77 and used visual stimulation to test whether their brains still showed evidence of the specific cellular mechanism underlying learning and memory formation. They did. The researchers concluded that neuroplastic changes in the visual pathway can continue into late life. Direct evidence, in living adults in their late 70s, that the machinery of brain change is still functional. A comprehensive review, published in the journal Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, examined the relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and brain structure in older adults across many studies. The consistent finding across multiple imaging methods was that older adults with higher cardiorespiratory fitness showed larger brain volumes in the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and, importantly, the hippocampus, the same region that grew in the taxi drivers. This is not one study you can dismiss. It's a pattern that has replicated across research groups and imaging techniques for over a decade. More recently, the American Psychological Association published a 2026 review in their Monitor on Psychology that laid it out plainly. Research now indicates that older adults who engage in learning multiple new skills in a supportive environment can over time achieve cognitive test scores similar to those of younger adults. That is a remarkable claim, and it's not being made by a supplement company or a self-help author. It's being made by researchers publishing in the flagship psychology journal in the United States. So the honest answer to the question in the title, can your brain really rewire itself at any age, is yes, with an important qualifier. The capacity is real, but it isn't automatic. Sitting on the couch watching television will not activate it. The research points repeatedly to the same handful of conditions that seem to reliably drive brain change in older adults. Let me walk through them. The first is genuinely new learning. Not familiar activities you've done for decades. Those keep existing pathways healthy, which matters, but they don't build new ones. The kind of learning that appears to drive neuroplastic change is the kind that feels a little uncomfortable at first. Learning a language you don't already speak, picking up a musical instrument, learning to draw, or to code, or to use a new piece of software that intimidates you. The research suggests that the difficulty is part of the mechanism. When your brain is forced to build new pathways to handle something unfamiliar, that construction is what neuroplasticity looks like in action. The second is aerobic exercise. This is one of the most consistently supported findings in the entire aging brain literature. Regular cardiovascular activity, walking briskly, swimming, cycling, is associated with larger hippocampal volume in older adults across multiple studies. The mechanism involves increased blood flow to the brain and the release of a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth and survival of neurons. You don't need to be running marathons. The studies typically look at moderate activity, 30 minutes most days. The third is genuine social engagement. Not passive social media scrolling, but real conversation with real people about substantive things. Loneliness in older adults is associated with faster cognitive decline in observational studies, and the reverse, active, meaningful social life, is associated with slower decline. The brain appears to treat social interaction as a complex cognitive workout, which in a sense it is. Tracking what someone else is thinking, choosing your words, reading their reactions, remembering what they've told you, that's a demanding set of tasks, and demanding tasks are what drive plasticity. The fourth is sleep, and this one is often overlooked. During deep sleep, your brain consolidates the day's learning, clears out metabolic waste products, and does much of the cellular maintenance that keeps the plasticity machinery working. Chronic poor sleep in older adults is associated with worse cognitive outcomes across the board. If you're consistently sleeping less than 6 hours, or waking up unrested, that's worth a conversation with your doctor, because addressing it may matter more than any brain training app you could download. The fifth is managing the health conditions that are known to accelerate brain aging. Uncontrolled high blood pressure, poorly managed diabetes, untreated hearing loss, and chronic inflammation all appear to hinder the brain's plasticity. Working with your doctor to keep those in check isn't just about your heart or your ears. It's about protecting the environment your brain needs to keep adapting. Now, I want to be honest about the limits, because you deserve a complete picture rather than just the encouraging half of it. Neuroplasticity is not a cure for Alzheimer's disease. Once the pathological process of Alzheimer's is established, no amount of language learning or aerobic exercise will reverse it. What the research suggests, and this is a real distinction worth understanding, is that active cognitive engagement across the lifespan appears to build what researchers call cognitive reserve, a kind of biological buffer that helps the brain function well even when age-related changes are present. Two brains with similar amounts of underlying age-related change can function very differently depending on how much reserve was built up over the decades. Building that reserve at 70 is not too late, but it is different from claiming a cure. The other honest limit is that the effects of these interventions are typically modest at the individual level and become meaningful mostly with sustained practice over months and years. If someone is promising you that 6 weeks of a specific program will dramatically transform your cognitive function, be skeptical. The real picture is more like consistent, gentle pressure applied over time, producing real but gradual change, which, when you think about it, is how most biological improvement works. Muscles don't dramatically transform in 6 weeks either. They just get a little stronger, week after week, if you keep showing up. Here's what I'd suggest as a practical starting place if this topic has caught your attention. Pick one genuinely new thing to learn this year, something you have never studied before. It could be a language, an instrument, a craft, a category of history you know nothing about. The specific choice matters less than the fact that it's new. Give it 3 or 4 sessions a week for at least 30 minutes. Second, add or protect a regular walking habit. 30 minutes most days, at a pace that gets your breathing up. Third, look at your social life honestly. If you've been withdrawing since retirement, or since losing a spouse, treat rebuilding connection as a health priority, because that's what the evidence suggests it is. Fourth, take your sleep seriously. And fifth, keep your regular medical appointments and stay on top of the conditions that quietly wear the brain down when they're not managed. None of this requires a supplement. None of it requires an expensive brain training subscription. The evidence for those is thin at best. What the evidence actually supports is broader, simpler, and honestly more empowering. The ordinary, everyday choices about how you spend your time appear to be the real drivers of how well your brain ages. Your brain is not a fixed object you inherited at some point in your 20s and have been slowly losing since. It is a living system that continues to respond to what you ask of it, well into your 80s and beyond. That's not motivational language. That's what the imaging studies actually show. And that means you have more say in this than you may have been led to believe. I'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. What new thing have you learned in the last few years, or what would you like to try? Reading your responses is one of the things that shapes what I cover next. If this was useful, please subscribe so you don't miss the next video, where I'll be covering the specific type of hearing loss that recent research is linking most strongly to cognitive decline in adults over 60, and what the current guidelines say about when to act on it. Thanks for being here, and take care of yourself.